Left to their own madcap devices, the girls formed a tribal bond, speaking their own language and minting a clattering thicket of nicknames for their parents. Dad was Fav, Mum was Muv, and also for one another. Unity was Bobo, Diana was Honks, Jessica was Decker, Deborah was Debo, and so on. Their nannies, governesses, menagerie of pets, and anyone else who strayed across their radar. Although taken to the extremes by the Mitfords with their shrieks of laughter and floods of tears, as Nancy would later put it. This sort of upper-class twittering was very common in the pre- and post-war eras. What elevated the Mitfords above the prattle and privileges of their upbringing and put their reputation on a collision course with history was the fissure in the household between the two raging ideologies that would rip apart the 20th century, fascism and communism. When they talked about what they wanted to be when they were grown-ups, writes Mary S. Lovell in The Sisters, the Saga of the Mitford Family, Unity would say, I'm going to Germany to meet Hitler. And Decker would say, I'm going to run away and be a communist. And so they did. Flighty as they may have appeared, the Mitford girls did not lack for follow-through.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you, Geoff, for reading that intriguing extract by James Walcott from Vanity Fair, talking about the Mitford sisters, which is the subject of today's pod, and is a timely subject because, as we all know, we celebrated Mother's Day on Sunday, so we thought that a sort of chatelaine kind of motherly icons. I think the Mitfords in many ways are mothers of country houses, all that kind of jazz. We thought that we'd do an episode on them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rory.
Yes, without further ado, Geoff, can you introduce the Mitford sisters? Tell us who they are, why they matter, how they relate to country houses.
I would love to. Thank you, lovely listeners and viewers, for joining us. And we hope to all those mothers out there that you did have a very happy English Mother's Day on Sunday.
Oh, yes.
Of course, I think the Americans celebrate it on a different day, don't they? So in England, I know that certainly we're recording in advance, but we'll be going to church and all the mothers get little bunches of daffodils from the children go up. It's all rather lovely here. And it's springtime and the sun's shining. And what better time to talk about these extraordinary sisters? So the Mitford sisters have fascinated people for years. They've got that sort of cult status that a few sort of groups of people have, the Bloomsbury group, the Bloomsbury set, or, suppose, that's a good example. They sort of got this strange cult status where people are obsessed with them. And I've always found them fascinating because they lived such different and extraordinary lives. So in a nutshell, the Mitford sisters were 6 sisters, all socialites. They were the daughters of the second Lord Redesdale. So they were aristocratic Englishwomen. They were all born in the early 20th century. I think Nancy was born in 1904 and Deborah was born in 1920. So quite an age gap between the 6 sisters. And they were known particularly for their wit, for their beauty, and for their extreme political and social views, as that introductory quote implied. And really they become icons, cultural icons, for their involvement in so many different things. So we'll talk about it a bit more. But in a nutshell, this is who the 6 sisters were. So there was Nancy, who became a famous novelist. She was sort of I don't know what a good example is, the sort of Barbara Cartland or I don't know, Jilly Cooper of her age. And she wrote some brilliant books, The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, which were adapted for film. I think the most recent adaptation has Lily James in it and Dominic West. So Nancy the novelist. Then you've got Pamela, who's number 2, who is, bless her, she's the only Mitford sister who didn't have a Wikipedia page for a very long time. She's perhaps the most normal one. She's known as the Rural Mitford. And she basically led a quiet life as a chicken farmer in Ireland. Then we get more exciting. So we've got Diana Mitford, who was known to be the greatest beauty of the age. And she was married initially to a Guinness of the great brewing family before she ran off with Oswald Mosley. Sir Oswald Mosley, who, for our listeners, was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, which were the Nazi sympathizer group in the UK in the run-up to the Second World War. So she ran off with Oswald Mosley, the fascist. Then you had Unity, who was born a few years later, who was an actual Nazi, who moved to Berlin. She was supposedly Hitler's lover and Goebbels' lover and various other, who knows. But we do know that the day war broke out, she went to the English Garden in Berlin and put a bullet through her head with a pearl-handled pistol, but the bullet didn't kill her, and she lived for another 10 years with it lodged in her brain.
Sorry, I should laugh.
I know, it's extraordinary. Bless her. The Mitfords did so many extraordinary things, but they couldn't. Poor Unity couldn't kill herself. So then you get Decca, which was her nickname, Jessica, who is the opposite of her sisters who preceded her. So Decca was a committed communist, like a rabid socialist. And she campaigned for civil rights. She was an investigative journalist in the US. She ran off with her second cousin, who was also her lover, to fight in Franco's war in Spain. And interestingly, Jessica Decca was actually closest to her sister Diana, who was the fascist. So fascinating. And then we've got the youngest Mitford, who perhaps is the most well-known in society in Britain, and that was Deborah Mitford, known as Debo, who later became the Duchess of Devonshire, and her husband inherited Chatsworth, which our listeners, I'm sure, know as sort of the grande dame of English country houses, the most extraordinary house in Derbyshire. And she turned it around, really. You know, she's one of these great chatelaines that will go down in history for saving our greatest country houses. She came up with all sorts of clever ideas for monetizing the estate, and was also a countryside icon. Like her sisters, she wasn't afraid to speak her mind and campaign for all sorts of things, countryside issues. So that's really where they are. And so that's sort of, I suppose, a summary of who the Mitford sisters are.
Thank you for that little trot through. That was helpful. What a collection. I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, I know a fair bit about the Mitfords, as a lot of people do in England, but I didn't realize they were quite that extraordinary.
I mean, and also they were stunning. If you look at, there are some wonderful sort of, I don't know if you call them aquatints or sort of colorized sketches or something, or etchings of the six sisters, and they were all absolutely beautiful. And then if you look at photographs, people like Diana, who was the most beautiful supposedly, they had these piercing blue eyes. It was so almost milky blue, so pale, they were sort of piercing. And even in her old age, I mean, these eyes like ice. And her son, actually, interestingly, was Desmond Guinness from her first marriage, who saved Castletown House, which is
I'm getting confused. So Diana's first husband was Desmond?
No, Diana's first husband was Brian, and their son was Desmond. So Diana had two sons with her first husband.
Okay.
So
and then
Diana
the
and Brian's son,
Oswald Mosley.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So, which means that Desmond Guinness, the savior of Irish country houses, his stepfather was Oswald Mosley.
Oh dear, poor old Desmond. That's terrible. Oh wow! I mean, this is just extraordinary tapestry.
All this overlap, yeah, and their houses also, their whole lives, and this is why it's so relevant for the Country House podcast. Apart from being extraordinary women, albeit for some having rogue views, they were extraordinary women who also their lives were so intertwined with country houses, their love of country houses, their hatred of country houses, their everything about it, which is why it ties in so nicely with this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you sort of, the 1930s in many ways was the last hurrah for country houses, consistent hurrah for country houses in the UK, before it all really went pretty wrong after the war. And so these houses, forgive me, are associated with house parties full of glamorous young things, bright young things, as they were called, often who were very political and had very different political views. It was a time of great schism. And so in many ways, the Mitford sisters are the best personification of that kind of climate, which very much occupied, again, country houses at the time. But tell me, Geoff, I mean, that really is extraordinary, because, usually in a family, people tend to have the same sort of political opinions or lights.
Speak for yourself, Rory. I mean, my sisters and I are like the Mitford sisters Mark II. I mean, I'm a, reform shade of conservative, and my big sister's a Lib Dem shade of green, and my little sister's a centrist. I mean, we are in a smaller family, completely on opposite sides. But maybe your family are less. Maybe you know what it is. Maybe it's the plantations. They had tea plantations in Ceylon. We had tobacco farms in Zimbabwe. Maybe it's that makes us think differently.
I have to start a Country House podcast. What's the word?
Political
bingo. No, bingo for every time that we hear about Zimbabwe.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, we should.
I'm teasing you. Yeah, maybe. I'm gonna say that I don't know. I mean,
I think
feel
you're right. Most people do. When I speak to most of my friends, if they voted one way, it's because their parents or their siblings have a similar views. It's true. There is generally,
I
you
don't
do
think
get
that
that.
people copy their parents, but I think that they're just brought up, and the general kind of ambience feeds into what become their political opinions. And sometimes people react against them. I mean, to flatter you, Geoff, sometimes it's the mark of a very clever family where they all, have very strong opinions.
I wish that were the case with us.
But of course, my superior liberal instincts tell me that I should allow you to. But no, anyway,
For our lovely listeners, if you want to tune into a better version of The Rest is Politics, where people actually disagree on politics, you should tune into our new podcast launching soon.
Yes. Well, I wonder what we'd call it. Anyway, how to disagree disagreeably.
Exactly.
Anyway, but no. So tell me, how was their childhood extraordinary? I mean,
it was quite extraordinary. I mean, actually, it was. I mean, that quote I started with implied that it was quite common for these children to grow up in eccentric homes with great privilege. This was a particularly unusual home, I think, because we'll talk about their childhood in a second. In terms of houses, so their grandfather, who was the first Lord Redesdale, inherited this massive estate in the Cotswolds called Batsford, near Morton in Marsh, and he was not particularly financially savvy. And decided to spend all his money building a massive new house, which he then couldn't afford to run. So he builds this enormous new house at Batsford called Batsford Park,
right.
which is sort of a Jacobean, Victorian pile. And at Batsford, and he was actually a really interesting man. He was a writer and a collector. He wrote a book called Tales of Old Japan, and he
sounds very commercially minded.
He was not commercially minded at all, Rory. He was spot on. He was said to have fathered 2 children with a geisha girl, and may have fathered Clementine Hosier, later Clementine Churchill, Winston Churchill's wife, when he was having an affair with his wife's sister, Blanche, who was mother of Clementine. So hilarious. I mean, obviously the Mitfords' sort of political instincts came through.
So they had a really lovely, stable childhood.
And they spent the First World War at Batsford. Their grandfather was still alive, and the younger one, so the older ones who were already born by the time of the First World War, they grew up had their early years at Batsford House.
Can we call it Batshit Crazy House? I think that'd be much more appropriate.
Well, what's fascinating, right? So he builds it in the late 1890s, and when he dies, his eldest son, the second Lord Redesdale, the Mitford sisters' father, couldn't afford to pay the death duties and keep up the house, and so he had to sell it. So this house was only in the family for the estate was in the family for a long time, but the house was only in the family for one generation, literally. This guy, the writer and collector, spent all his money on the house and the collection.
And he's the grandfather.
He's the grandfather.
Okay.
But it meant that the girls were brought up in this extraordinary pile which had all the latest technologies. It was like your modern mega mansion of the day. And they lived there in the First World War because they didn't it may have been partly requisitioned. But anyway, then what happens is in 1919, just before Debo, the youngest, is born, his family's, in fact, I think he sells it before, but they move in 1919 to Astle Manor. So they move out of Batsford. They sell Batsford to the Wills family of Wills Tobacco, which was the biggest tobacco company in Britain. Bingo.
Really? That's interesting.
And they did buy tobacco from certain countries, which I'm very familiar with, but I won't mention which, Rory.
My family have a close connection with the Willses. Actually, I have. Okay, well, that's time for another story. But
another story, yes. Well, so the Wills family still own the house and the estate, and in fact, it's still a private home. It's not open to the public, but the garden has this phenomenal arboretum in it, the Batsford Arboretum, which is open to the public and is really, really cool. So Batsford, they move out of Batsford. They move to father inherits the title in 1916. They move in 1919 to Astle Manor, which is this magical Jacobean manor house in the heart of the Cotswolds, a village near Burford, not far from Oxford. And it's this really pretty gabled manor house with the River Windrush, which is a really pretty name in itself, running right through the grounds of the Windrush Valley. And he had inherited, this had been a secondary estate for the family. Sadly, the Mitford sisters' father, the second Lord Redesdale, was also not particularly canny with money. And we could talk about what happened later. in due course. But the girls essentially were brought up in this amazing sort of crumbling old manor house. They went from living in a brand new Victorian pile to living in this old, 17th century manor house. And their parents were interesting. So dad famously only ever read one book in his life. He claims that he read Jack London's novel White Fang, and he enjoyed it so much he vowed never to read another one. So he was not literate. He didn't get into Eton. He didn't get into Sandhurst. All he cared about was hunting and shooting and fishing. And so every weekend he would host all his mates from his club in London for hunting, shooting, hunting, shooting, and fishing weekends. And the girls sort of were very close because they had one brother, Tom, who we can talk about in a bit. But essentially, I mean, where to start really? So the girls had no. So they lived in this very pretty house at Astle. Big age gap, one's 16 when Nancy's 16 when Debo's born. They have no formal education, so they were largely homeschooled by their mother, Sydney Bowles Mitford, whose father had actually set up Vanity Fair, the magazine. So a link there with why I opened with the quote from Vanity Fair.
Very good.
And yeah, their brother Tom did the classic route. He was, the golden boy. He went off to Eton and then Oxford, whilst the girls largely were actually left to educate themselves. Nancy helped to teach her younger sisters and so forth. And this led really to this extraordinary sort of melting pot of different views, because if you've got a 14-year-old teaching a 6-year-old something, then they're going to teach them maybe some quite rogue things, or some have some ideas that are really out there. And so that partly explains, I think, why they thought so differently. Their father was super eccentric. So famously, even when he was a kid, he had these tantrums, these fits of rage, which sort of were manifested even more strongly in his fatherhood. So he hated foreigners. He wouldn't eat foreign food. He wouldn't even eat Italian food. He would only eat British food. He detested anything modern at all. He hated. He believed that women and girls shouldn't be educated formally. And it's interesting that all of these girls ended up, despite the lack of formal education, going on to achieve remarkable things and being sort of pioneers in their fields, albeit some slightly rogue fields.
Pioneers in fascism. I'm not sure.
Well, no, Nancy as a writer, and Deborah, I'm thinking particularly.
Could we say pioneers in botched and deeply ironic suicide attempts?
Well, yeah, quite. But they were. So, I mean, I'll give an example, Rory, of some of the ways in which they were brought up as children. So they set up their own little club called the Ons, the Hons Club. They actually call them the Hons, even though you wouldn't normally pronounce the H, or Huns. And that's because the children of a baron, they were given a courtesy title of honourable. So they were each the honourable, and they decided to take their on and turn it into Huns. Huns and Rebels was one of the books that Nancy Mitford wrote. And they used to meet up in the laundry room and have little discussions, like a sort of salon amongst sisters. And they had their own language, which they called Boodledidge, which is and they had all these sort of secret rules and codes, and they used to tell each other stories. And then they had some other rather really cool things. So I found this out when I was reading Debo's memoirs. And when they were kids, one of their favorite games in the world was being hunted by their father, who would hunt them on horseback with hounds. So they kept hounds at their house for horse riding, local hunt. And their father, who loved hunting, would send his daughters out into the woods each with a rag of soaked in fox urine, and they were going to hide. And so it's kind of like a game of hide and seek, except he would then ride through the woods with his hunting horn and his pack of dogs, who would then sniff out the girls. And of course, when they found the girls, unlike foxes, they didn't kill them. They sort of ran up to them and licked them, and the girls thought it was great fun, or at least that's what Debo said in her book. But that inspired later, and we'll get on to their later lives, but inspired a number of characters in Nancy's novels. I'm thinking particularly of Uncle Matthew.
Well, yes, and this is kind of what I want to ask you. I've seen bits of the recent adaptation. I haven't admittedly seen all of it, and it was very, very good. But what you're describing, it's called The Pursuit of Love, right? That's The Pursuit of Love. I mean, it seems like their childhood was totally lifted into that novel.
100%. I mean, there's this wonderful scene of, I think it's Uncle Matthew, who is played by Dominic West, standing on the front lawn with his gramophone blaring, whipping the ground with his whips. And it's sort of, just and then there was Uncle Merlin, who, Lord Merlin, who was this eccentric aristocrat who was based on Lord Berners.
Yes,
Who
exactly.
dyed all his pigeons different colours, and they lived at nearby Farringdon. So it's all linked. It was very much a semi-autobiographical novels, really, that Nancy wrote.
Yes. I'd like to add to our non-British listeners that this is not a standard UK childhood in the 1930s. It might seem it because these are the stories that become famous, but this was very, very eccentric, and has borne many legends afterwards, which is partly why it might seem more ubiquitous than it was.
It's interesting, Rory. I found a quote that sort of sums that up, which sort of mentions this. It says, "The Mitford sisters' childhood was both privileged and peculiar, which fostered strong personalities and radical beliefs. With little outside influence, they absorbed extreme ideas from books, guests, and their own imaginations, which led to wildly different destinies."
Yeah, I mean, I think when you opened and described all of their really bizarre fates, it makes sense. Their childhood, I mean, it adds up, doesn't it? It really adds up. This sort of crazy cauldron of imagination and fun and kind of educating each other, and some very peculiar views from the father. I mean, it all, yeah, how interesting.
But it was also interesting, I think, Rory, and that links to that, is how different sisters sort of jumped on different aspects of the same childhood. Because if you think about it, so yes, their dad was eccentric and often funny, and Nancy ended up being a complete comedian. She bought into the she could see how silly the whole situation was that they were living in, and so what she did is she was both incredibly funny all the time, a complete comic, but also very witty and didn't like to conform to social norms, which is the opposite of some of her other sisters. And then you get Pamela, who, as number 2, was slightly overlooked, but also wasn't influenced by too many older siblings, which is why Pamela perhaps led the quietest life. She had no pressure. But then you get the middle 3, which have this sort of melting pot, and then finally you get Deborah, who was sort of the last chance saloon, number 6, to sort of teach her how to grow up well. And she was raised to marry well, maintain the family
youngest
name.
are always the most normal, aren't they? It's so irritating. I'm an oldest sibling, which means that I'm basically a complete neurotic.
My youngest sister, is exactly the most normal. I think you're absolutely right.
Are you the oldest, Geoff?
I'm the middle.
You're the middle. Oh, okay, right. Well, better not talk about that then. No, but it's really interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about them, not just in that they typify this kind of 1920s, 1930s vibe, is also that they exemplify the tensions of the period. In that the role of a woman at this time was, I think, quite ambiguous, because after World War I, when women had had jobs in the war, they started being enfranchised. The role of women was becoming much more significant in society, and yet they were also expected to have this. Well, no one quite knew what role they were meant to have, to be perfectly honest. And at the same time, you've got all these different political creeds which are bubbling up. And so the Mitford sisters, and in some ways, are very modern because they've been brought up in this modern house, and yet their father doesn't want them to have an education. Yet they're clearly very bright, So they really typify all of the different things that are going on at the time in this very. I mean, if you want to use a metaphor, society in the 1920s and 30s in England was a bit like a dropped mirror. It was cracked all over the place. It was sort of, there was schism, which, as we know, boiled into the unfortunate events that went on to happen in Europe later on. But so just talk to me a little bit, Geoff, about Nancy Mitford, and then we can move on to some of the others. So
let's think about Nancy first. I think that's a good idea. So Nancy, it's interesting actually. Normally the younger children are actually the comics, but actually, in this case, Nancy was brought up to love humor, but she was also very, very bright, and I think frustrated that she couldn't maybe go to university like her brother, or at least go to school like him. And so she she ended up becoming this wonderful novelist and biographer. So she wrote her most famous novels, as we mentioned, are Love in a Cold Climate and The Pursuit of Love, which were written. Pursuit of Love was written first, 1945, and Love in a Cold Climate written 4 years later. And they're semi-autobiographical comedies. They're actually comedy of manners, is the type of literature they are, which satirize the British aristocracy and both mock it and celebrate the eccentricities. That's what's so interesting, is she has this love-hate relationship with it, where on the one hand she thinks it's absolutely absurd what people like Uncle Matthew do, and at the same time there's sort of this, and people like Lord Merlin, but then at the same time there's this sort of strange sort of love for.
Yes, that's very fond. There's
Yeah,
my favourite moment with Lord Matthew. I don't know if this was made for the film or whether it was in the novel, but it's very, very funny. Is when Lord Merlin or
Lord
Lord
Merlin.
Bernard's
Yeah,
figure turns up with two of his dogs, and he says, "Can my dogs have a drink?" Because it's a hot day, and I think it's the person who's sort of narrating the book, as it were, or the film, turns up with two saucers of water, at which point Lord Merlin says, "Not water, whiskey." And these whippets sort of look very irritated at the fact they've been served water, not whiskey.
that's fantastic.
Which is just brilliant. Very, very, very good. But
Yeah.
okay, so that's
So,
who she was. And just
well,
remind me where she
really,
was in the pecking order.
Yes, she was the eldest, and
Okay.
she was born. I mean, she only really. So she was one of the great socialites, but she only really was sort of skyrocketed to, sort of becoming a well-known figure in Britain with the publication of The Pursuit of Love, which was published just at the end of the Second World War, 1945. And really it captured exactly the Second World War marked the end of that life, because we know that all these houses were requisitioned during the war, that many of them never ever were lived in again. But the last time they'd been lived in was exactly in the time when these girls were growing up. And so she sort of had captured in a sort of little, I suppose, in a book, what the last of that sort of life was like. And so it was an incredibly popular book. And she became super well known, and she wrote lots of biographies as well. She wrote a biography of Madame de Pompadour. She wrote a biography of Voltaire. She wrote a brilliant set of essays on you and non-you, which was about the upper class and non-upper class speech, and about class distinction, and all sorts of other things. I mean, fascinating. And then, but interestingly,
you have to explain to us, because I actually can't remember myself. What does you and non-you mean?
I think it means upper or non-upper, I suppose.
Oh wow! Okay, gosh. So if you were you, presumably you also were an on and got to be in the laundry cupboard.
I guess so. Yeah.
It's very cliquey.
The upper class was you.
Yeah.
And non-upper class was non-you. Yeah, I suppose that's what it is.
So
and I'll give an example. So in her list, there'll be things like you would say napkin, non-you would say serviette. You would say sofa, non-you would say settee.
So she was quite a snob.
She was a complete snob. And this is the funny thing is she loved the best things about it. She on the one hand pushed away from her family childhood upbringing, but at the same time looked down on those who hadn't had it. It was sort of
she was a champagne socialist.
She was exactly that.
Interesting.
Actually, she worked in a bookshop in the Second World War, which is why she loved, which really sort of encouraged her love of books.
Okay.
And then she ended up moving to France after the Second World War, where she spent the rest of her life, and was eventually joined by her sister Diana. And we can get onto that.
Well, we will. I mean, I suppose as a final remark on Nancy, what I find interesting about her work is that, as you put your finger on it earlier, it's playful and funny in quite a wholesome way. And when one thinks of the authors who capture life in the 1920s and 30s, you've on one end of the spectrum, you've got Evelyn Waugh, who writes this really cutting satire, which is incredibly funny, but really quite dark. And then on the other hand, you've got someone like P.G. Wodehouse, who writes about, Bertie Wooster and house parties and stuff. And it's great, but it's completely saccharine. I mean, it's just like, it's polyfiller. Whereas what Diana Mitford does is, Nancy Mitford, forgive me, it's got a bit of bite to it, but it's always playful. And it's not meant to be nasty. It's teasing, but it's not mean, basically. Which I think is perhaps the best combination.
It's interesting. You mentioned Evelyn Waugh as an example. So Nancy, but prior to the Second World War, was part of the Bright Young Things. The Bright Young Things were a bohemian group of aristocrats and socialites during the Roaring Twenties. Who are some examples, Rory? Betjeman. Well, no, people like Betjeman, Evelyn Waugh were inspired by them, but I suppose the Bright Young Things were people like. Yep. The Sitwell siblings, they were Bright Young Things, weren't they? Brian Guinness, who married Diana, was a sort of a bit of a mix. It's sort of there's a condensed group. People like there are some people, Evelyn Waugh, Oliver Messel, Cecil Beaton were sort of Bright Young Things, but they came a bit later. But what's really interesting is there was a lovely reference that Nancy mentioned to Evelyn Waugh. So I noted this down, but she when she moved to London. So actually, what's really sad, Astor Manor was sold almost only 10 years after it had been moved into by her family. Her dad made extraordinary extensions. He built this massive ballroom on the back of this quite humble Jacobean manor house.
I quite like this guy. I just like the absolute total disregard for money.
Exactly. So he built a Edwardian ballroom with an oriel window on the side of this humble Jacobean manor house, and then 10 years later he'd run out of money again and had to sell Astle, and built a house still on the estate at Swimbrook nearby, which is where most of the Mitfords are buried. And anyway, so Nancy, and they were terribly sad. The girls were deeply upset about this, but they threw themselves into their new life in London. And amongst Nancy's new friends was Evelyn Gardner, who Nancy informed her brother Tom in a letter was engaged to a man called Evelyn Waugh, who writes, I believe, very well. So maybe there's a bit of a competition between Nancy and Evelyn Waugh.
I bet that was.
And I suspect Nancy was quite a snob about Evelyn Waugh, because Evelyn Waugh was the middle class writer looking in.
Yes, she desperately wanted to be posh and wasn't. Okay, but this is fantastic and wonderful.
Yes, I mean, we slightly digress, but yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about.
There is. So let's now talk about the oddballs, Diana and Unity. So,
well, Jessica could be seen as an oddball as well. Let's. She was a proper communist, so let's.
Okay, let's start with the fascists, and then we'll move on to the communists.
Okay,
one could even say that about a family. Let's start with. So they're really interesting with the Mitfords in terms of fascism, because the Mitfords are it's an iconic household name. A lot of people will know about the Mitford family. They won't necessarily know why they know about the Mitford family, but they'll have heard the name because they'll know about one of the sisters because they're all famous. And so it's a weird thing, in the UK, we don't tend to associate people with fascism because, I mean, Britain was the country which fought Germany in World War II. So it's a kind of bit of a cognitive dissonance there. And they're a bit of a strange ... that people don't really talk about because British fascists were, not common, or at least we don't like to think they were common. So how did they get into fascism? Why did they support fascism? I mean, let's just trot through that subject.
Yeah, it's great questions. Okay, let's start with sort of how did they get into fascism? So it was really a mixture of personal and ideological beliefs and social influences. So they admired these what appeared to be strong, free-thinking men. So Adolf Hitler in the case of Unity, and Oswald Mosley in the case of Diana, which might speak something about perhaps something they lacked or longed for, with their father being a free-thinking, outspoken man. Maybe that's something
there might be some pretty major daddy issues going on.
There might be some daddy issues going on there. Because Diana, having married in the society wedding of the year to Brian Guinness, and heir to the Guinness fortune, she then met Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union Fascists, and ended up running off from Brian, leaving poor Brian with two young sons who he basically brought up on his own, including Desmond. Whilst Diana went off with Oswald Mosley, and they married in 1936 in Nazi Germany, where they invited one of Oswald Mosley's great heroes, Adolf Hitler, to be a guest at their wedding. So Diana admired Hitler, and she believed that fascism offered a sort of a strong alternative to what she believed was failures of democracy. So she looked at democracy, she thought it was failing, and she thought authoritarian regime would solve those problems. But she also, like Nancy, was a snob, and she believed very strongly, had an elitist belief in hierarchy and clear pecking order, which she sort of bought into wholeheartedly. Oswald Mosley was a baronet, so was also from a grand family, so it was very easy for them to talk about, why communism was so bad and why fascism was so good, because they would be recognized as more senior because of their status, perhaps. And we could talk about what happened to her in the war in a minute. Well, basically, in a nutshell, she married Oswald Mosley. They lived in Britain, but during the Second World War, they were put on a list of people who were dangers to the British freedom and democracy. And in the end, they were imprisoned for the duration of the war because of their support for Nazism. And what's interesting is they were basically told that if they sort of repented, if they said that they didn't back Hitler, then they might go free. Essentially, I think her dad pulled some strings, and essentially, if she was to deny her Nazism, she wouldn't be locked up. But she refused to do that, so she'd rather go to prison than swallow her principles. So incredibly sort of stubborn, which is interesting, which can be a virtue or a sort of not a virtue.
She was separated from her children, wasn't she?
She was. So Brian sort of had custody, I believe, and sort of, yeah.
Because it's very, I mean, I was fascinated. I mean, years ago now, I listened. There's a Desert Island disc of Diana Mitford. It's absolutely extraordinary. And they ask her all about her support of Nazism and whether she met Hitler and stuff like that. Amazing, extraordinary thing to hear on the BBC. And I think I dimly remember her saying that she might have regretted not recanting the Nazi stuff, or certainly regretted the prison sentence, only because it meant that she basically became estranged from her children, which I think was the thing she found most painful. That's fascinating. But it's also a sign of how powerful the Mitford sisters were in a way, how much social capital they had, that after the war, Diana Mitford became a sort of curiosity, and that she was given a Desert Island disc, for goodness sake, having been, considered quite literally a traitor, which is why she was arrested. I mean, it's an incredible story. Okay, so
there's Diana, and we'll come back. There are a lot of overlaps between the two, but Unity was sort of Diana on steroids. So she wasn't just an admirer of Hitler; she was infatuated with him.
She was a fangirl. I mean, she was obsessed.
She was obsessed. She went out to Berlin in the hopes of meeting him. She eventually did. It was a little bit Saltburn-esque how she sort of ingratiated herself into his inner circle. And she was really embedded in Nazi high society. The issue was with her is that she adored England and she adored Hitler. She adored England. Her childhood was so strangely idyllic. She loved Britain, and she longed, Rory, for Britain to unite with Hitler against socialism. That was her sort of great dream. And so she sort of was trying to sort of push for that. She was using her connections to try and persuade British politicians and so forth to sort of align with Hitler. She saw that fascism as a really exciting, radical movement that offered an alternative from traditional conservatism, which she found sort of unsuccessful and stuffy. She was also very anti-Semitic, so she bought into Hitler's anti-Semitism completely. But she failed in her quest to make Britain and Nazi Germany unite. And when Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, it was essentially like, someone being served their divorce papers. I mean, she was heartbroken because the country she loved and the man she loved were suddenly at war with each other. And so she went into the English garden and shot herself. But she died 9 years later in 1948. So for 9 years, she was left with severe brain damage, the bullet gradually moving through her brain, killing her day by day until eventually she died. Really sad. She ended up living rather isolated with her mother on this little castle on a private island the family owned off the coast of Scotland, which had been their sort of holiday home. An extraordinary little castle on this rather rugged island. And it was actually rather interesting on a slight side note. Debo, and I think it must have been one of the other sisters, I can't think who it would have been, maybe it was Jessica, were on this island with Unity when suddenly they were sent back to London because of the Blitz or something, I don't know, and they had to go and get their things and move to their country house. And Debo and her sister had to go across from this island to Scotland with, I think it was a goat and a cow, because they kept a goat and a cow on the island for milk. But they had to get the goat and the cow back across. So what they did is the girls had to row across the sea with someone helping them. And there's a goat and this cow swimming behind, tied to rope. And then they get to the mainland, sort of Fort William or something, and they hop on a train and sit in the sort of cattle carriage of this train. Just these two girls, no older person. I think Deborah must have been, I don't know, 15 or something, and whatever. And they're sitting on this train on their own, going down to London, surrounded by cows and goats and sheep.
So does that mean that technically the cow is in loco parentis?
Well, yeah, but what I find extraordinary, Rory, is why today, parents that are worrying if their child's, running late after a date when they're 18. Parents get so worried these days compared to.
I know the world's going to the dogs. It's very interesting that sorry, I'm muttering up my nose. Unity and Diana they do represent two totally different sides of fascism, don't they?
Mm.
I mean, Diana is the cool, intellectual, logical reaction. I'm an
Yeah.
aristocrat. Fascism is good for me, type thing. Whereas
Unity's just gone mad.
Unity is just like this obsessed, and a lot of
Yeah.
people were. I mean, the Nazi Party were very effective at using new mediums, new media, propaganda, radio, etc. They were very sexy for a time.
Yeah.
Hitler, as we all know, had a lot of fangirls. Anyway,
Mm.
extraordinary. And I actually think I listened to the rest of his history the other day, and they did an episode on Unity, and I think they were saying that Hitler, was quite flattered by this interest from a British aristocrat as well. So it was two ways a bit. Anyway,
we know that people who often it's people who don't come from an aristocratic background but end up in positions of great power. They're always attracted to something they can't have. They can't suddenly have a lineage that's great, and so they're attracted. I find this quite interesting.
Well, they like power, and the UK aristocracy is associated with power.
Exactly, and it's ancient compared to so many other countries. We've got families that go back millennia. So yes, you're right. But then what's also interesting is because of their background, they were. I found this really interesting. I read this earlier, Rory. Their privileged upbringing exposed them to extreme ideologies because they met so many different people and read so many different things. They were reading newspapers from abroad in German or in French, which most normal people couldn't do. But also because of their wealth, they didn't have the same concerns of ordinary people, so they could afford to be ideological. And I've noticed
their wealth, surely, presumably, it would be their
wealth, their wealth, their status, whatever it was. The fact they didn't have to worry about putting food on the table and B about the future meant that they could think more ideologically. And I've noticed this. I don't want to get too into politics, but it is interesting that it's people who either have everything or nothing who are able to be more ideological because you've got nothing to lose necessarily. In the same way as people who are sort of in the middle classes, who have some things but aren't willing to risk losing it, but also have enough that they don't want to. You know what I mean? It's interesting.
It is interesting. Well, that's another podcast. We should do a podcast about bright young things in country houses.
We must do, yeah.
Okay, so let's now flip the coin and talk about Jessica Mitford. I can't remember which sister she is, but she's the opposite. She's a communist.
She is a communist, and she ran off with her cousin to fight Franco's war in Spain. So Jessica, I think she came number 4. She was number 5. She was just before Debo. She was born 1917. Debo was born 1920, I think.
Okay.
And Jessica always, I think possibly like a sort of any sibling, wanted to do the opposite of her sister. So her two older sisters were Diana and Unity, who brought into one, or maybe Unity was younger than her. I'm trying to remember, but she wanted to do the opposite of Diana, basically, who was the sister she was closest to. So Diana and Jessica famously wrote to each other for years and years and years, loved each other, adored each other, and yet Jessica wanted to be the opposite of Diana. So there's a lot of psychoanalysis that can go on with these sisters, which is interesting. But Jessica totally rejected everything about her childhood in terms of the status, the aristocracy. She did not want to preserve any sort of hierarchy. She wanted to bring down the hierarchy, and she became an activist with the communists. So she was inspired by the Spanish Civil War. She rejected everything about the class system, and she ended up eloping to Spain, as I said, with her left-wing lover, Esmond Romilly.
Excellent name.
I know, who was actually Winston Churchill's nephew and therefore her cousin. Anyway, and so she ran off with her second cousin or whatever to fight against Franco and his fascists. And she basically put her money where her mouth was and lived a pretty modest, meager existence for the rest of her life. So she ended up moving to the US, and she supported the USA Communist Party. She became an investigative journalist, exposing all sorts of things. She wrote an expose on the funeral industry scam in an article entitled "The American Way of Death." And she lived a very modest life, campaigning for civil rights and trade unions and stuff like that. But she continued to write to her sisters. There's a wonderful collection of letters between all the sisters.
Would it be fair to say that she wasn't so much a communist as a socialist? Because, I mean, going to fight against Franco doesn't necessarily make you a communist.
That's true. Though she joined the U.S. Communist Party.
I see. Yes,
but I think, if I'm honest, she was a purist, much like Diana and Unity were, and that she wasn't going to go half-hearted. She wasn't going to be a semi-right wing or semi-left. None of the Mitfords were going to do semi-anything. Socialism is sort of an in-between, and she was never going to buy into that. She was a full-blown.
But did she support Stalin, for example?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I haven't. So I only ever, when I've read the Mitfords letters and books, it's always when they're writing to each other, and so I don't know if she did. I don't think she was ever critical of Stalin, but I don't know how much she admired him. Yeah,
sounds
it's
like
true.
she was a bit more of a functioning communist than the others were fascists. Interesting. Okay, so that's Jessica. And we've talked about Diana and Unity in World War II. So now let's fall to the youngest Mitford, who, I mean, in a way, I suppose, because she's the least messed up, because she's the youngest, usually the least messed up by their parents' theories of upbringing. She does the most normal thing, which is she does what people of her class would be expected to do, doesn't she?
She does, yeah. So she marries the younger son. She married the younger son of the Duke of Devonshire, the 10th Duke of Devonshire, who was not expecting to inherit anything, and so she married well. She married someone who was steady and stable, from a good background, but wasn't going to sit in the House of Lords, for example. But then her brother-in-law, so Andrew Cavendish, her husband's older brother, was killed in World War II. And interesting for our American listeners out there, Andrew's brother, the Marquis of Hartington, the one who was killed in World War II, was actually married to one of the Kennedy siblings. So he was married to Kathleen Kick Kennedy, one of JFK's sisters, who had the title Marchioness of Hartington, and she would have been the Duchess of Devonshire had her husband survived World War II. But she ended up being the dowager when he died, and she later died a few years later in a plane crash with her new lover, who was the Earl Fitzwilliam. So it's fascinating. The Kennedys again come into all this. We know that they're in the American embassy in London in the lead up to World War II. So the Kennedys knew all these families, the Mitfords and the Cavendishes, quite well. So Debo marries the younger brother, who then suddenly, when his brother's killed, becomes heir to not just one of the greatest dukedoms in England, but also one of the greatest houses, if not the greatest house in England, Chatsworth, in the Peak District, and all their other estates. And so what's really, fascinating, interesting, is they were sort of the first really high-profile family to be hit with massive death duties after the Second World War because of there were laws, I won't get into detail, whereby if too many heirs, you had to die a certain amount of time apart, basically, for you to, I think, I'm trying to remember, basically, in essence, the Duke and then his son and the Marquis of Hartington died very close to each other, but rather unfairly, they were whacked with full death duties for both. So
to our non-UK listeners, what that means, it's very, I mean, it's a very punitive tax in the UK, but the kind of the landowner's worst nightmare is if you don't have your house in trust as a charity, basically, or something like that, and you are fully responsible for its value. When you die, you have to give 40% or a significant percentage of it away to pass it to your child. But the problem is that if there's a horrible accident or two people die at once, the government doesn't waive the second person. They'll make it essentially 80% of the value because you've got to do two lots of 40%. So if that happens to you, you're toast, basically. But they managed to get around it, didn't they?
Well, they did and they didn't. So the 10th Duke, Debo's father-in-law, died in 1950. And they were given, so in these days, after the Second World War, there was a Labour government, a socialist government, who had implemented an 80% inheritance tax bill. So you were taxed 80% of the value of your wealth, and that included assets. And so they were taxed £7 million in 1950, which is equivalent to about £320 million in today's money.
So were they taxed 160% of their wealth?
It's a good point. I'm not entirely sure, but 303 million in today's money, or 320 million, depending on who describes it. And that's of course also not taking in line with the fact that things were cheaper in those days. So I mean, extraordinary amount of money they had to pay, and so they had to. So Debo suddenly becomes a Duchess of Devonshire. Her husband's now the Duke, and they're whacked with this tax bill for £350, call it £1 million, and they have to pay it somehow. And
Amazing.
so what do? Is they have to first try and flog things, but they don't want to flog everything. And so what do? They flog at massive auctions, the great Chatsworth sales. They sell Van Dycks, they sell Rembrandts, they sell tens of thousands of acres of land.
Gosh.
They furniture, antiques, paintings as well, all sorts of things. And they give one of their stately homes to the government in lieu of cash. So what they did is Hardwicke Hall, which we've done an episode on in the past, Hardwicke Hall, that great Elizabethan prodigy house.
Which was a bit of a dower house, wasn't it?
It became the dower house because Bess of Hardwicke's children ended up marrying into the Devonshires. So what you end up having was this amazing, probably the greatest Elizabethan prodigy house, phenomenal long gallery and everything, was given to the government.
Innovative, I think.
Yeah, it was innovative. And it was given to the government in lieu of death duties. So essentially the value of the house and its contents, whatever contents they gave, and its land was valued, and then that amount of money was then knocked off their taxes. Right. So Hardwicke Hall was given to the trust, and they thought about selling Chatsworth as well, or knocking it down. There were so many things they thought about doing, but they couldn't, because Chatsworth was, a duke without his seat is, well, in some ways, it's a hard place to be, isn't it? A duke is all about his
pilot without his plane.
Well, it's a king without his kingdom, really. It's a duke without his seat is like a king without his kingdom. So what you end up having was Deborah had to work out a different way to help Chatsworth cover its costs. And so she was one of the first people to open the house to the public. So back in, I think it was right in the... It's still in the 1950s, 1959. They renovated the house, which hadn't been lived in really since before the Second World War, when it was requisitioned anyway. They renovated the house, turned it into a home, and they opened it. Actually, originally, parts of it were open to the house just before the 10th Duke died. So part of the house was open actually in 1949. But then in the 50s, they renovated it and then opened pretty much the whole thing to the house.
But Geoff, hang on a second. I can't believe for a moment that opening your house to the public would help to cover a 300 and something million tax bill. I mean, how much money were they making from being open to the public?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, no. So the tax bill was paid for by the selling of everything.
Oh, I see.
The point was they then had no money at all. So how do you run a 40-bedroom stately home with no money? And so they had to then work out a way for it to pay itself, because of course land prices have plummeted, agricultural prices have plummeted, so you didn't suddenly make money off the land.
Well, maybe they could build an extra couple of ballrooms just to spend the last money, like the father did.
Exactly.
Good job she didn't inherit his financial awareness.
Oh no, Deborah was incredibly financially aware. She was one of the great country businesswomen of the 20th century.
I kind of want to just riff on that for a second. So I've never really known. I didn't know a huge amount about Deborah, to be perfectly honest with you, but she's probably, as far as I'm aware, probably the most famous Mitford sister. I think she's the one I've certainly heard the name the most, as it were. But is she famous merely because of the contrast between her occupation and those of her sisters? Or is she famous just because she was a successful duchess? Or was there something about her that was particularly unusual?
I think a mix of all those things. I think the fact that she came from a fascinating family, well-known sisters made her well-known. The fact that she became, she was still one of the, she was really seen as the queen of the north in some ways, in terms of the Dukes of Devonshire were the greatest landowners in the north, vast estates in Yorkshire, vast estates in the Peak District. We've talked about this before in terms of landowners and country house owners being sort of kings within their own little kingdoms. Everyone in the local communities would look up to them in the same way that a country might look up to their monarch. And so she was sort of elevated in their part of the world naturally because of her status as a duchess, but then also she became well known because her husband sat in the House of Lords, so he was a politician, so he was able to push through bills and so forth. And Debo, really, she was an outspoken champion of the countryside. So it's kind of, chicken and egg. Did she become well known because of her hard work, or was she well known because of her being a socialite and a duchess, and then her work ended up eclipsing it? Because what she's remembered for now is not necessarily being just a duchess. She's remembered now, or a Mitford. What Deborah is remembered for, I would say mostly now, is for being one of the great chatelains of the 20th century, who managed to monetize the estate and monetize an estate, make it not just wash its face, but make a profit, and a great campaigner for the countryside. I mean, the first political rally I ever did, Rory, was the Countryside March in
Why am I not surprised?
99 or 2000, and it was the biggest political rally ever in Britain at the time. It was when they were trying to ban hunting, and everyone from the countryside came to London and were marching through, from farmers and every class, whatever, from all over the country, marched down Piccadilly or the Mall, and leading up front was Deborah Devonshire with her staff, her cloak billowing behind her, sort of like Gandalf. The Gandalf of the countryside. Amazing sight. And I must have been about 9 or something at the time. But it's tricky to tell. I think I would say something which is interesting is I think it took a long. I think they actually managed to negotiate. The family managed to negotiate that even though selling all that stuff didn't pay off the death duties, they were able to negotiate with the government that they would pay it off over a longer period of time so they could keep Chatsworth. So actually, a lot of the profits from Chatsworth were actually then went to continue paying off the debt into the future. So it sort of delayed the debts. I mean,
so that makes sense. But just tell me a bit more. I mean, I often hear people talking about Debo doing these kind of economic miracle with Chatsworth. Other than opening it to the public, I mean, what exactly did she do?
So she was a fantastic PR woman as well. So she set up a number of businesses on the estate. So she opened the house to the public and modernized, restored it. Managed to successfully, one of the few people who really managed to successfully keep it as a family home and as a tourist attraction, which was quite tricky. Some families end up moving out.
Well, it's very big, to be fair. So you can create
very big. That's true. So it's become over time. It's become one of Britain. It's become the most successful of Britain's stately homes. One of the most successful tourist attractions. It attracts over 600,000 visitors a year, and tickets aren't cheap. I think it's sort of 30 quid a pop to visit the house and gardens. So you're making good money from the visitors alone. But then she was also really savvy as a businesswoman. So she set up. So one of the first people to set up a sort of farm shop, organic cafe. The Chatsworth farm shop was incredibly successful, selling all the food grown on the estate. She ended up opening a second branch in London, which didn't do quite so well. She made a garden centre. They set up a sort of little mini sort of petting zoo with guinea pigs and rabbits, kids happy. And she also promoted or believed greatly in sort of diverse livestock. So rather than just... she sort of led the charge with the sort of new breeds or rare breeds that were more fashionable to maybe have milk from or beef from. So rather than just having regular cattle for beef, she would get some sort of obscure Scottish breed that has really good beef or something. And likewise, rather than Frisian cows, stuff like that. And so she sort of led the charge with making organic food fashionable and all that sort of stuff.
So a lot of the things that we now regard as commonplace around country houses, as it were, in the commercial zone, were in fact pioneered by her.
Absolutely. And she was also like her sister, she was also very, very good publicist in terms of being a writer. So she was a fantastic writer. Her books are brilliant. And what's wonderful about her books, the first one I think is Counting My Chickens. They're sort of, some of them are they're also semi-autobiographical, or they are autobiographies, and some of them are letters. But what's lovely is she was able to really promote her ideology through her writing, because she wrote so beautifully and so captivatingly. I've read, I think, all of her books, that she somehow convinces you. I think if you read a book by Debo describing the trauma that these farmers went through during the foot and mouth crisis in the early 2000s, then you can't help but be convinced by her arguments, because she's so winsome and wonderful in how she writes.
Funny, isn't it? I mean, I've never thought about it in this way, but I suppose she shows the best sides of all of her sisters. She has the humor of Nancy in her writing, which is very attractive. She has this sort of, I mean, the fascist sisters, I suppose she has this
no nonsense approach.
No nonsense, but also a kind of loyalty to a part of England, or ways of living in England that were dying and were under threat. She had a generosity and a social spirit that you see in her communist sister. So kind of she's sort of all of it rolled into one.
She sort of, yeah, you're right. She sort of distilled the best attribute. And you're right, actually. It's funny. She ended up being the grandest of all her sisters, yet was possibly the least snobby, or maybe alongside Jessica. Like, she famously treated everyone on the estate like equals. She was interested in everyone from the grandest prince to the lowest pauper.
Well, she was very famous for knowing a lot of writers. I mean, this is the funny thing. She was very intellectual, and I mean, she wore it very lightly, just as she wore her class very lightly. But she was quite a sort of fierce. She was a lot cleverer than her husband, who I don't think was terribly bright by all accounts.
Well, I think she was incredibly sharp, but also you see that in her letters. And actually, Rory, I'm sure I know you're aware of this. She famously, her best friend was Paddy Lee Fermer, the travel writer. And do listen to our episode on that. It was one of Rory's first episodes shortly after he joined us last year. And it's really fun. It was a summer holiday special about Paddy Lee Fermer's house in Greece. He was the great gentleman traveller of the 20th century. And he was best friends with Deborah. And there's a wonderful book of their letters written from Paddy all over the world, normally to Deborah either at Chatsworth or Lismore Castle in Ireland, the Dukes of Devonshire's Irish home, which Patrick Lee Fermer loved. And
it's called In Tearing Haste.
It's a wonderful book. Yeah. It's a great sort of book for the downstairs loo, because you can dip in and read a short letter, depending on how long you need to be in the loo for. It's great.
It's an extraordinary book, isn't it? Because it has everything from the both of them writing about their experiences of the JF Kennedy assassination, which is really moving, through to kind of mad problems to do with introducing chicken breeds in Chatsworth. I mean,
exactly.
Everything in between, absolutely extraordinary. Well, Geoff, I have to say, I think this episode's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Rory. I mean, we could have easily done a whole sort of episode on each sister, and certainly we should do. There are several episodes we could do in each of their houses. I mean, Astle Manor alone is probably 2 episodes, and Batsford 3, and Chatsworth 5 or 10.
Well,
I mean,
why don't listeners get in touch and tell us which of the aspects of this episode they'd like to hear more on, and then we can expand it.
That'd be great. Yeah, lovely. And I suppose just to sum up, as a family, I think. I mean, I don't know, Rory, why do you think the Mitfords continue to be such a source of fascination and intrigue for people? Why do you think there's sort of this cult status around them? Do you think it's because there's someone for everyone? That there's, for the right wingers out there, there's Diana, and for the left wingers, there's Jessica, and for the aspirational, there's Deborah. What do you think? Why do you think the Mitfords have such a cult status?
I know. Do you know what? I don't know. I think it could be the fact that as I said earlier, they kind of encapsulate the 1920s and 30s. It could be that, as you say, there's something for everyone. I mean, they all excelled in their various fields, as you said.
But also, they were in some ways, they were at the right time, at the right place, in terms of these women with extraordinarily different views from a privileged background at the end of sort of British aristocracy as it had always been. It was sort of where aristocracy or the class system, literature, women's rights and politics all sort of collided with each other just at the right time, when you suddenly had Nazism taking off from one part of Europe and communism in another, and everything going on in Britain at the same time, and the fall of the class system and everything like that. It was sort of their views were everything that the whole world was going through at the same time, distilled into one family, I suppose, which is why it was.
Yeah, exactly. Amazing. I mean, there's a tradition in England of kind of famous groups of sisters, and we could probably do an episode on that as well, actually, kind of aristocratic sisters doing all sorts of interesting things. But they're probably the most famous, I'd say.
I think you're right.
Of all the groups. Well, It was lovely to explore the ons. It was. I feel weirdly non-you, actually, having learned about them. They're sort of so preposterous, but very interesting. Thank you, Geoff. That was beautifully told. Listeners do catch us teasing each other on YouTube, where you can see our lovely faces, if you want to do that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.